Morning, everyone, and welcome to our 2024 webinar series. I'm Lane Mosher. I'm a forester with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative. And today we have kind of a different webinar format. You've probably seen our poll here that's ongoing. We'll keep that open for the next about 25 minutes or so and unpack some of those results after. But please do take a moment to fill that out to the best of your knowledge. But otherwise, today we have David Wilson with the Minnesota Forest Resources Council and Charlie Blinn with the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota. So Charlie, let's take it away.
David, I'm going to let you take it away here.
All right, sounds good. So today we're going to, try to answer the question, where's that water going, and dig into some of the erosion control practices that are really important to the harvest planning process, mainly to keep forest soils in the forest and out of the water. Charlie, do you want to go to the next slide? So a little outline of our webinar today is, first we'll talk about why erosion control is important. We'll talk about some planning things that need to be considered, different options for erosion control, potentially road closure, other considerations related to erosion control. We'll have a poll result from the initial poll you took on the way in, asking what some of your favorite erosion control structures, practices are. And then we'll have an erosion control activity at the end where you all will get to design some erosion control for a real site on the Cloquet Forestry Center. And we'll have some question and answer about that to see what everyone came up with. So next slide. All right, let's dive right in and talk about why we care about erosion. And really it's pretty straightforward. When I was thinking about this, putting this slide together, really there's one statement that covers it, and it's just that erosion degrades forest soils and impacts water quality through delivery of sediment, nutrients, and organic matter directly to surface water. That has effects on the qualities of the water for wildlife, for fish. On the map to the left, you can see the Lake Superior North Shore watershed. The brown lines are trout streams, and the greener area represented by the National Land Cover data is forest. So we have a lot of trout streams embedded in the forest here, and so we're really concerned about that water quality, and has a lot of effects if we don't manage erosion properly. Charlie, next slide. All right. One of the things I've done over the past 4 or 5 years is I've worked as the Guideline Monitoring Program consultant. I've been in the position with the Minnesota Forest Resources Council for the last year as the applied forest scientist, but I still have a handle in the guideline monitoring data. So what we're looking at here is the use of erosion control practices on approaches to water features. So those are streams, lakes, wetlands. So between 2020 and 2023, there were 325 sites assessed. 192 of those had approaches involved for a total of 880 approaches to water bodies. 65 of those needed erosion control because of the slope and the length of the slope involved with approaching that water body. 20 of those had the erosion control that was recommended installed, and 14 of those approaches total had erosion. 6 of those eroded approaches resulted in sediment being delivered to a water body. So, I mean, if we break it all down, we've got about 30% compliance for erosion control use on approaches where it's needed. And it's not needed everywhere, but we need to assess the slope and the slope length and the soils involved to determine where to install erosion control. What I will say is that we can probably do better in assessing our sites and planning where to put needed erosion control in. So 44% of non-compliant approaches needing erosion control had erosion. So this is really where that sediment gets delivered to the water. Approaches serve as a direct conduit for sediment to enter the water body if there isn't erosion control applied. And so then 43% of the approaches with erosion delivered sediment to a water body. So we can kind of see where neglecting the erosion control results in less than ideal outcomes. I'm going to talk a little bit about water quality segments. It's kind of a strange concept, but what the guideline monitoring program does is goes around, looks at all the skid trails, roads, landings to see if there are slopes and slope lengths involved with the infrastructure that would require erosion control to be used. And so on 34% of the water quality segments needing erosion control, it was installed. So there's what is that, 66% that we can improve on. 23% of the water quality segments had erosion present, but these water quality segments aren't on approaches, so no water quality segments delivered sediment to a water. They're further away from the water bodies. Still, we need to control that erosion. Next slide, Charlie. So I wanted to take a closer look at erosion control on landings and skid trails in particular, because we all are pretty sensitive to the roads and where they're going and keeping them out of filter strips and wetlands, avoiding wetlands and things like that. But there are issues with erosion on some of the filter strips around wetlands, and they're in particular concentrated in areas where infrastructure encroaches on those filter strips. So where a landing might creep into the filter strip and approach a wetland, or a skid trail gets established in the filter strip. Those conditions often result in erosion and soil compaction. I did look up the numbers of roads, landings, and skid trails, and I honestly, I can't get that information because it's behind Zoom on my screen. But what I can tell you is most of the numbers represented here, these filter strips with erosion, they're divided between landings and skid trails. I think there were about 17 roads out of these 87, sorry, filter strips with erosion. 84 of those were associated with infrastructure. So really keeping the infrastructure out of the filter strips and away from the wetlands is super important. But the key guidelines here, I wanted to highlight those, are to minimize the amount of new roads, skid trail, and landing area at the harvest site. Of course, we kind of know that. But locate new roads, landings, and skid trails away from sensitive features like RMZs and wetlands, and then minimize erosion, compaction, and rutting in general. But to prevent sedimentation, we also need to minimize soil disturbance and promptly revegetate, so seeding disturbed areas, slow down and inhibit concentration of runoff, so use slash mats on skid trails and things like that. Direct runoff to stable areas away from water, so use water diversion structures to accomplish that goal, and then capture any sediment within the runoff by slowing that water down and allowing it to settle out. Charlie, next slide. All right, I'm going to quickly go over the FMG revision process that the Minnesota Forest Resources Council has been engaged in for the last 3 years, and then a little bit. We started in 2020 with a stakeholder survey requesting feedback on perceptions of how the guidelines are being implemented and their effectiveness. The guideline monitoring program also reviewed all the past reports and identified some problem areas where maybe some clarifications could help with understanding of the guidelines and how and when they should be applied. Because I mean, we all know that the guidelines don't apply on, not all the guidelines apply on every site. It's more of a buffet that we can pick the relevant guidelines from. We also did a scientific literature review in 2022. Created an executive summary kind of encapsulating the 3 previous prongs of this review approach. And then we engaged in some focus group discussions in 2023, digging into a few topics that had been identified as possibly needing updates. Next slide, Charlie. So those 3 topics, and I'll just cover this quickly. The guidelines would be negligent if they didn't include some climate change considerations. We know that heavier precipitation is the norm now, heavier precipitation events. We have warming winters. This past winter is kind of blows the top off of the warming winters concept. But in general, that's a trend. We also found that the invasive species considerations needed to be updated with newer information on effective practices. And then, as I mentioned before, some general revisions and clarifications. Next slide, Charlie. So there aren't any major changes related to erosion. Those practices are really well established, and Charlie's going to go through some of them in a little while. They're really well established. So the basic practices haven't changed, but some consideration of what heavier precipitation events means for concentration of runoff is important, and potentially considering closer spacing of erosion control practices where those concentrations of water overland flow are likely to happen. Additional focus on when to seed exposed soils associated with infrastructure and erosion control practices are also in there. There's a little bit on steep slope RMZs, especially where overland flow from further up in the watershed may be resulting in slumping of the high bank RMZs. So that's an erosion issue, but it's more involved with planning for your RMZs. I mentioned some minor clarifications and potentially additional filter strip width and or stabilization measures could be in order in certain conditions. Oh, I see that there's a question about what is an RMZ. That's a riparian management zone. So within the wetter area on the transition from a wetland or a water body to terrestrial habitat to forest, upland forest. Very importantly, related to climate change is considering the impacts of warming winters on preferred operating season, including those winter conditions, changing precipitation patterns. We'll probably want to be using lower ground pressure equipment as sites are less frozen. And then check and monitor that frost depth and soil conditions as we're getting into the site. And I think this is the end of my part, and we're going to hand it over to Charlie to dig into some of these particular practices now.
Yeah, thanks, David. As David said, we're really concerned about erosion, not only on roads, but also on landings and skid trails. And we're concerned about it not only because of water quality, but also because we're spending a lot of time and effort to build infrastructure. And we want to make sure that infrastructure is going to be present, not only for use today, but in the future too. So we want to protect that investment by providing appropriate erosion controls. So here's an image of a forest road and shows surface and subsurface flow. So some might say that the first commandment for a good road, skid trailer landing, is to get water away from that surface. Remember that water flows downhill. It needs to go someplace, and it's a problem if it isn't flowing. So that water can come from hillsides, it can come from intercepted precipitation from above, and can move downslope also. So the science tells us there might be really 3 different approaches to think about reducing water, soil and water impacts. And the first one, David, I think did a great job talking about it, is avoid water wherever possible. So in your planning process, think about what are some alternatives that I could implement to avoid crossing water, building approaches, or so on. A second thought really takes me back to physics from a few years ago. And the thought there is that momentum is measured as a product of mass and velocity. So the amount of sediment that will be moved is a product of the amount of flowing water and the speed at which that water is traveling. So we see here, we've got an incised road here. It's below the sides adjacent to it. So we can't really get water necessarily off this road. So we can't handle the mass, but what we want to do is slow down the velocity. If we can slow the velocity, chances are we'll do something toward reducing erosion. So always think about momentum. Get water off the road if I can. If I can't get it off, what is it that I can do to slow that down? And the third one takes me back to that soils class that I took a couple years ago, using the modified universal soil loss equation concepts. So what we want to do is try to minimize the average loss of soil. We can't do really anything about rainfall, but we can manage through planning these things over here that have asterisks next to them. So think about the soil erodibility. We know that soils with a silt and fine or very fine sands are really highly erodible. So in planning, if you can, try to stay away from them. Stay away from long slopes or steep slopes, and then provide some vegetative cover, and then use your conservation practices. Some might call them erosion control practices. So all these things are things we can incorporate into planning as well as implementation on the ground. Just keeping those universal soil loss equation concepts in the back of our mind. So some of the erosion control best practices might be look at the existing access and use it if it really is going to provide good access and will limit erosion. Locate roads to minimize the amount of cut and fill, minimize the road width and length, minimize the amount of water crossings. So all three of those things, all four of those things, are really things I should do in the planning phase. So now that I've decided where to put my road, I want to try to minimize the amount of erosion by controlling, capturing, and diverting runoff, beginning on the top third of the slope. Some might say that if I start there, I can reduce the amount of erosion by perhaps up to 2/3. And then if I'm going to be away from the job for a while, put erosion controls in there also. So I might end up moving equipment from one site to another, or the end of a season, the end of winter. I'm not going to come back till next winter. We should have erosion controls in practice before we leave the site. And always think about revegetating exposed areas as soon as they're exposed. So according to our FMG guidebook, and maybe we'll get a link posted in the chat there, we've got different approaches for managing water, and I've listed just some of them here that are in our toolbox. Road shaping, water bars, broad-based dips, cross-drainage culverts, straw bales, and excelsior rolls, brush and slash, and then lead-off ditches. The page numbers represent where you can find information about that in the field guide. And then some of these are really useful on both active as well as closed roads. So where I've used light blue, it's something we could use, and I should have put one here also for brush and slash on active and closed roads. And we can also use these in combinations with each other. So a leadoff ditch that takes water away from the road could be used in combination with lots of these other options up here. So road shaping is just exactly that. We might have a crowned road where it's higher in the center. We might divert water in toward a hillside or away from a hillside, so insloping or outsloping. And then here's some for 12 inches in horizontal distance, maybe just shape that road by 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. That's all it takes to move the water in one direction or the other, to get the water off that road, and then seed the exposed surfaces as soon as possible. Water bars are, I think, one of the more frequently used options on closed roads, but you build a shallow 6-inch trench that upslope, and then use that soil from the trench and then mound it up to about 1 foot high, placed at a 30 to 45 degree angle from horizontal on the road. So the spacing on that might be up to 12 feet in length. We've got our cut here, our fill is here, and then we move on. So we can see in the image that we've combined our water bar with a leadoff ditch that heads off to the left. In some cases, we might want to put a broad-based dip because water bars are difficult to drive over. And so a broad-based dip is just a longer stretch. In this image here, it is up to 160 feet long, could be longer perhaps, but it's used on active roads with a gentle slope. And we're going to dip it outward about 3% just to move the water in from this dip to the outslope side. Our guidebook has water bar spacings as well as broad dip spacings. So the lower the slope, the farther apart we can put these, but as slope increases, we're going to place them closer together. Again, beginning at the top of the slope. We might have a system where we put in a ditch on the side of the road, and we've got a crowned road. And so we moved water over to one side of the road. We want to move it through that road prism to the other side. So we have a culvert that's angled 30 degrees from horizontal across the road. We've got a ditch block over here to catch the water, to divert it into the culvert. And then we've extended that culvert through the toe of the fill slope to make sure that that fill slope isn't eroding into the culvert itself. Might use straw bales. And so put straw bales on that 30 to 45 degree angle across the road, stake them in the ground, and then compact on the upslope side the soil so that it'll hit that and then divert the water into that lead-off ditch. And then Excelsior rolls, which are also talked about in the guidebook. It's just a natural wood blanket. It's made of frequently 100% aspen with a polypropylene net sewn together in some sort of a degradable thread. So an 8-foot by 112 feet, I looked on the internet, costs about $160. The nice thing about this is you can easily cover a lot of area with one of these erosion control blankets. I think slash is a commonly used option on both active and closed roads. It's something you want to make sure you drive over the material to get it in contact with the soil. So unlike this image over here from our guidebook, we want to make sure we apply it liberally across the site and then drive over it to really make sure it's in close contact with the soil to help slow down the velocity of any water that might be moving. And then finally, at the end of the job, we want to close the road. But when we do that, we're going to want to think about what might be impacted. So maybe there's some cultural sites beyond that road closure where people need to get in to pick berries, for wild ricing, for maple syruping, for birch barking, other sort of uses. And so we need to make sure we check with others about their use of the area behind, in this case, a gate. And then use existing natural features. So there might be a hillside on both sides to try to enhance that closure structure. Or it might be water bodies over there that make it more difficult to get by, or rocks, or something else. So look for a location that's going to enhance that closing structure. So we could use on-site materials or something we purchase, such as a gate. We want to also think about a number of different considerations. So the first one is a number of things related to the timing. So we want to communicate our expectations as managers to the operators on the site, both in a pre-site meeting as well as a reminder near the end of the job, so that they can ensure that they have the proper equipment there when these options are going to be installed on the ground. So it might cost $500 just to return a dozer back to a job site on a lowboy. So that operator is not going to want to do that. And so you need to communicate as a manager your expectations to them, again, pre-site as well as close to a few days before the end of the job, to let them know to remind them of those expectations. There are differences in the ability of equipment. So while a dozer might be good for road shaping, building water bars, broad-based dips, cross-drain culverts, and so on, a skidder might be better at putting slash on the ground or moving materials for road closure. And then people can move straw bales and Excelsior rolls, but they can't do a number of other things. You also want to think about leaving the site. So at the end of winter, if they're going to come back to the job site, make sure you put erosion controls in before you leave. Or if you're going to leave the site to get moved to another site because it might be too wet, install your erosion controls before leaving. And then season has an impact too. You can't move frozen soil in the winter, So slash may be the best option at that point in time. So beyond timing, you want to think about monitoring. So monitor the site during active operations to make sure that erosion is not happening and that you're minimizing that. But also as you drive around, look at other job sites and see what erosion control options have been installed and how effective they are. Think about future use of the road too. So if you're going to be getting back in that area soon, perhaps you don't want to spend a lot of effort into putting road closure options in there if they're going to be taken out very quickly. And then as David, I think, did a nice job talking about our revised guidelines, you're going to have some additional thoughts about changing precipitation patterns. So if we're going to have increased rainfalls or rainfalls that are heavier, we want to think about maybe increasing the number and size of erosion control devices, or minimize the slopes during planning, or slow the water that might be running in ditches through the use of straw bales. So with that, I think we want to close the poll results and see what you have suggested are the water diversion options that you use most frequently on active roads during non-frozen conditions. So I'll stop sharing my slides and look at the results. So it looks like the most common ones, and it's almost a three-way tie, are broad-based dips, which are really useful, I think, on slopes where you're going to be on that active road, because water bars are not very effective there. Brush and slash are also very useful. And then cross drain culverts are the third option that you're using. So you must be having some sort of an option with ditches, and you want to move that water through the road prism to the other side where it can move perhaps down slope. Less frequently are things like lead-off ditches, but lead-off ditches, I think, work very well with other options. So you can use a lead-off ditch in combination with broad-based dips, slash with cross-drain culverts. Scrolling down, I also see that road shaping is used a lot too. So probably something that you're going to use a dozer with. David, any other comments?
No, I do not have comments on this, but there are certainly a lot of options for applying erosion control practices, and many of you are familiar with them. And so I think a big part of the challenge in front of us is probably identifying the scenarios where these practices are needed and then installing them according to the specifications.
And David, I noticed the last option on there was water bales, and it probably meant water bars, which some might have selected.
Oh, I
Yes, it
think you're
was.
right.
Yeah, I think it's odd that no one selected water bales, but I think that's definitely user error on my part, so I apologize, folks. But
Well, it would have been nice to have learned what a water bale was.
Yeah, why don't we jump right into the exercise here? I will try to share my screen. All right, I should be sharing a PDF of the SFEC erosion control problem solving scenario that we have set up. Is everyone seeing that?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'll go through this kind of just reading the text, and you all can read along. But I do want to highlight that this is a real scenario that exists on the Cloquet Forestry Center on some timber access roads that are currently in use. They are used to access various timber harvests throughout the Cloquet Forestry Center. The existing timber access road on the Cloquet Forestry Center traverses a small wetland at the bottom of the slope, and you can see that in the picture. It gets a little shadowy down there. And it's not a very big wetland, but it serves the purpose of the example here quite nicely. There's some moderate slope as the road approaches the wetland, and soils are extremely sandy, so they're very erodible. Accumulated runoff will carry sediment. Extensive rutting has been observed on this site, and regular maintenance is required to keep the road in usable condition. So that all costs money and results in delivery of sediment to the surface waters. Less than perfect. Repeated grading has caused the road to become incised over a large portion. So much like the picture Charlie showed of the road cutting through some pine trees, dug into the ground a little bit. And that presents some additional challenges for getting the water off the road. Management at the Cloquet Forestry Center would really like to reduce erosion on the site by installing appropriate preventive practices. And so what do you recommend is kind of the question. I'll get down to the full problem statement, but this is kind of the scenario. Do we have any questions at this point?
Feel free to use the chat if you have any questions, and otherwise we can move on to the next slide here. But
Okay.
folks also have an opportunity to raise their hands, and we'll unpack that in a moment here. But go ahead, David.
Yeah, so this next part of the problem really states the problem, provides an image of the topographic relief in the area. The red line headed from the star up towards the northwest is that road. I did my best to digitize that in using the freehand line tool on the Min Topo site. That might not be perfect, but it gets the point across, and we can see where the slope is and kind of along the road where the different slopes are occurring. So with this Min Topo tool, you can create an elevation profile for a road, for example, like we have here. And we can see there's about 16 feet of elevation change from 1278 roughly down to about 1260 where, or a little over 1260 where the wetland occurs, the red dot. And so that means that in this the closed section of the road, and I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, in the closed section of the road, we have about 7% slope over, I think I specified here, about 220 feet. And in the active section of the road, so this is beyond the wetland in that picture that we were looking at above, we have about 5.5% slope over a longer distance. And the incision that I was talking about where the road is dug into the ground is mostly in this area of the active road for additional information. Now, the problem that I'm posing to you is to design and place erosion control measures appropriate for the active and for the closed portions of the road. What you can do is note the approximate location of your proposed erosion control measures along the elevation profile shown in figure 2. Just write down kind of the distances from that x-axis, the bottom axis there. And then I'd like you to think about, let's see, specify the distance between those erosion control measures and the type of erosion control used, and then think about what additional actions you can use to stabilize the road and associated drainage and erosion control measures. Explain why you would make the choices you did. And then we'll submit these solutions via another Zoom poll that Lane has been kind enough to design for us. And we'll kind of see where the answers fall out and have some Q&A afterwards. So how long do we have for this, Lane?
About 5 or 6 minutes, but if we start to see some of the responses trickle down, then we can certainly get rolling sooner. But just to specify for this first poll, since rather than making it prohibitively complex, we're just focusing on that left side, that closed road. So just use your imagination and pretend it's closed. Just use that that left side, and that's the spacing. So I'll get this poll rolling here. Great, so I will end the poll here, end this quiz. Oh, one person's slid in right at the end, great. Yeah, just submit any last minute answers and then we'll end the poll, and then I'll, in a moment, just kind of set up my screen and we'll share some of these results. And excellent, I already see some folks in the chat, you're reading our minds here. Great, so I'll end the poll here and then call up these results. Great. And these are attached to the folks' names, but don't worry, there's really, I don't think there's any overtly wrong answers here. So what water diversion option we use on this closed road? Interesting, I don't see any water bales for my misclick earlier, but we do have water bars, slash mats placed every 100 feet. Lead-off ditches, broad-based dips, open ditch along the side of the road, more water bars, road shaping. Great. Any comments, David and Charlie, on this?
I saw something in the chat from Stanley. He mentioned that there seemed to be an opportunity to place some erosion control in the top third of the slope, which is an important point. Directing that water off the road before it begins to pick up velocity and really accumulate is a really important concept in erosion control. I also saw another comment that there seemed to be room to place 2 or 3 erosion control structures along the slope of the closed road. I would definitely agree with that. Would anyone else like to volunteer their solutions? And we can kind of see a distribution of where folks would place those erosion control measures. And getting into the thinking behind this is sort of the point of the exercise. I don't know if we identified spokespeople or anybody. We had originally designed this as separate breakout sessions. And so now we're having one big breakout session.
Yeah, we could at least here towards the maybe after we go through the rest of these results, we could call on folks, or if folks are interested in just kind of putting their insight in chat. But the intent for this question was to kind of figure out the interval along that slope on the closed road. And yeah, David, wanna?
Yeah. So those intervals really depend on the choice of erosion control practice. And that's why we see a big distribution here, I think. And as Charlie said, there really are no wrong answers here. But I'm really hoping that folks will jump in with some of the thinking behind why they placed potentially multiple erosion control practices, why so many of them are bunched up in the top part of the slope. And we mentioned that top third is important. And so I think folks are picking up on that and really digging into one of the main issues behind why erosion happens, which is that accumulation of water, that increase in velocity as it moves down the longer slopes, and then the sediment that it can carry with it in that mass of water. So those are really critical points, and from the distribution here, it looks like everyone's picking up on that.
Yeah, and David, so a lot of people said a water bar, and so according to water bar spacing and the idea of the project, I think it was 225 feet from top to bottom, so about a third of that is 75 feet. So you'd want to make sure you had something in that top 1/3, so within 75 feet from the top of the slope. And then, as you, I think, correctly said, really spacing from there depends upon what option you've selected. It's going to be a longer spacing if it's a broad-based dip, shorter if it's a water bar spacing.
One
Okay.
comment I'll make about slash mats, and that's definitely an option depending on the kind of traffic that's using the road. Skidders and things have no problem with bigger chunks of slash. A passenger vehicle may bottom out over a water bar or even a big log or things like that. But for the closed portion of the road, slash mats make perfect sense. And they can be applied liberally, as Charlie was showing in one of the pictures, one of his slides earlier. If the slash is available, cover the whole road with it and drive over it a bunch of times. It intercepts water, it directs it off the surface where traffic passes, and just stabilizes that surface in some very important ways to limit erosion.
And think about maybe having that slash staged during the harvesting operation, so it makes it easier when you're moving away from the job site to just pull it onto the road rather than having to go collect it from across the site.
So with these comments here, it looks like we've kind of covered these. Some of these looks like seeding, signage, barriers, yeah, reclaiming the road surface and other. Again, there's no wrong answers here. So thanks for tuning in, folks, and participating here. Do we want to go to the active road scenario, David? I can stop my share.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great.
And so we're going to redo this exercise then with the assumption that the road is active. So it's being used by the general public, not necessarily big four-wheel drive vehicles or anything. Someone might drive their Subaru down there. So with that in mind, would you do anything differently? And so we'll go through the exercise again and see what folks are coming up with and how that might be different from the closed road scenario.
Dave, you want to share your screen again just to show the image?
Sure, absolutely.
And so I just made that quiz active again. So yeah, this time we're looking at the right side of the road. Again, this is a very special road that's only closed on one side of the profile. So yeah, using the right side. And so note the slope is a little bit different. It's also a little bit longer, but we're kind of just asking the same questions here for this active incised road. And so we'll take maybe just a couple of minutes here. Some of the discussion is overlaps, but there is some distinctions. And then after this, we'll look at some of the results again and then go through some Q&A. So. Great.
So a lot of people said broad-based dips. Some said water bars. Might be hard for me to get my Lamborghini over that water bar.
Yeah, Charlie, with the longer distance involved with the far side of the road, the active portion, those broad-based dips make a lot of sense. They take a longer distance to really implement, but they do a good job if you have that space to work with and may not cause hang-ups in the undercarriage as much as water bars.
So looking at where folks might place their chosen water diversions on the slope and the interval. Anything jumping out at you? It seems like they understood the assignment when we said the top third. See a spike in that 75. Any other thoughts, you two?
Well, I just saw a comment that said it's hard to get the road to drain where it's incised there, and that's exactly right. That is one of the problems we're facing on that far side of the road, that active portion. So some creativity and some application of potentially cross-drain culverts and ditch blocks and like just doing something to get that water off the road.
Yeah, so here I can't handle a mass because the road is incised. And so what I would think about doing is maybe shaping my road. And so I'm going to shape it, maybe tilt it one direction or another with a ditch on that side that it's tilted toward. I might put straw bales in there then to slow down the velocity once it gets inside of the ditch. So I'm really thinking about momentum. I can't handle the mass inside of the incised area. So I want to get it off the road into a ditch perhaps where I put straw bales to really slow down the velocity. Or if I have water bars, I still want to maybe put it into a ditch and slow that velocity down, as long as I can still get my Lamborghini over the top of those water bars.
Good. Yeah, keeping an eye on the
Charlie,
road.
I'm not sure I would drive my Lamborghini off of Highway 210 there, which goes right past this area to the south. might keep it on the flat hard surface.
Yeah, this is actually just a case study in having POVs with a bit more clearance if you're going to be taking them on forest roads. That's one of our learning objectives for this webinar. But looking at some of the other comments here about some of these additional actions, and then we'll get into some Q&A. So feel free to use that Q&A function or paste in the chat. There's a couple already that we'll get to.
So Lane, it looks like some people kind of took the idea that I had, was shape the road and then use straw bales or slash or something in the ditch that's going to divert the water then.
Yeah, I saw something else here. Tough Bark, I like the handle, said the first dip at the head of the road diverting overland flow, but then open the canopy and seed. So getting some light down to the road surface so that vegetation can get established and hold the soil in place there. That's a super important point. And one of the most effective erosion control practices is really having a fully vegetated site where the work has been done, where the soil was exposed, but now we've covered it back up with vegetation. Vegetation is the best erosion control.
And if I needed to move the water from one side of the road to the other, I could use a cross drain culvert.
Great. So I'll stop my share here. And we do have folks aren't out of the woods. We do have one more poll. So before we get into the Q&A, and I'll leave this up for the rest of the webinar here, but kind of our returning visitors maybe note this is a little bit different than about a 45-minute presentation followed by some Q&A time. So we'd love to get folks' insights to see if this was an effective way to learn for y'all, or the same, or what are you doing, SFEC? Go back to what we're familiar with. So if you're willing, please take a moment to fill out that poll. And as far as our Q&A here, we did have a comment from Bud. Placing slash is an option that costs the logging operation time and effort, and that means who should be responsible for the cost of those erosion control practices. David or Charlie, any comments on that?
Yeah, I will respond to that. I saw that comment as well. And so who pays for the erosion control practices? Yes, they do cost something. None of them are free, even where the materials in terms of slash are essentially free. It takes time and effort. But in terms of paying for that, it is a cost of doing business, but the cost of doing the erosion control needs to come from the timber sale. Since this is attached to a timber sale, the landowner should probably be accounting for that in what they expect to make off the timber sale, and the portion of those proceeds that are needed to install appropriate erosion control need to be included in that contract, if there is a contract with the logger or whoever's doing the work. Charlie, do you have any clarifying comments on that?
Yeah, I think frequently it's the contractor who ends up paying for this. And it's also the contractor who has the equipment to install and to do a lot of this work. But what we probably haven't done a good enough job as managers is letting that contractor know through our timber appraisal report or anything that we use to advertise a timber sale about what our expectations are for erosion control at the end. And that would allow them then to include that in their bid.
Absolutely. And the concept of erosion control really should be a part of that bidding process. Folks should understand what's going to be needed, evaluate the site, and make the bid accordingly.
Great. I'm not seeing any other questions in chat so far. Earlier, we did get a question about defining the difference or overlap between riparian management zones and filter strips. That was, folks can click on Q&A and tab over. Eli cited some of the content from the Forest Management Guidelines page. We've also pasted our continuing ed credits link, so be sure to fill that out. That's in the chat for everyone. And our next webinar is on May 14th, so that whole week is going to be pretty crazy for for us. So on May 14th, we have our next webinar on climate ready woodlands. And then on the 15th and 16th, we have our field-based FMG workshops. And so this is a single day event. We're just offering it 2 days in a row. So when you're registering for that, keep that in mind. It'll be for one day or the other. I think if you might be disappointed if you come for a second day in a row and you're hearing the same thing again. Maybe that'll be beneficial, but beware. And I'm seeing not seeing any other questions. So thanks, David and Charlie, for talking about this really important concept, very practical, and something that everyone really has to address in some fashion or another, whether they're a manager or even just recreating on the roads and thinking about what someone else has done to keep those open. I did see a comment from Matt Petzjager about moose harvest and access for everyone, and thinking about other folks when closing roads. And thank you to all of our attendees for being engaged. And yes, the link for the CEs is in the chat. Thanks to all of our attendees for being engaged and kind of indulging us on something a little bit different. Hopefully you came away with some insights related to erosion control and water diversion. But yeah, with that, we'll see you next time. Take care. Have a great day.